from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
Let's begin our study in the book of Acts by stopping by first in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul talks a lot about his apostleship, about how he's needed to defend it, in that he's the one that was born out of due season, as he says, or he's not one of the original 12. But he talks about some of the things that he could have done and chose not to, and why, as far as choosing to be supported by the church in Corinth, or how he and Barnabas don't have a believing wife as the rest of the apostles do. They're single and so on. But one of the things that you see throughout the whole chapter, and then Paul gets real specific about it, in verse 19, when he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more." This is one of the overriding principles in Paul's ministry, is that he is a slave to no one. That is, that he is not enslaved to the approval of others, or that he needs others' permission, for he is serving the Lord, right? He's not being bossed around by anybody other than Jesus. So whatever any other person, be they Roman, Greek, the Jews, whoever it is, Paul serves only Christ. However, in serving Christ, he becomes a slave to all, in that if there's anything he can do in terms of his own preferences, his own approach, his own, I don't know if I want to use the word technique, but the way that he would relate with people, he'll adjust anything that he can as long as it's not truth. In other words, if it's tradition, preference, that sort of thing, he'll make those adjustments. And so he says, for example, in verse 22, "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some." And now let's go to our study in the book of Acts, and we'll watch Paul do exactly that in Acts chapter 21. So in the first 14 verses, Paul's journey has continued. It's finally brought him full circle all the way back around to Jerusalem. Several times now he has been prepared, not warned as much as prepared by the Spirit for what's coming. And we talked about how the others who heard the message considered it a warning and were trying to tell Paul, don't go back to Jerusalem. But Paul understood it as preparation, to prepare yourself. This is going to be rough, or it's not going to go well. But it's not a matter of God abandoning Paul. Rather, God is going to use, as we'll see over the next few chapters, the storm that breaks in chapter 21 will carry him all the way to Rome and will allow him unusual and unique circumstances to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's exactly how Paul sees it. So as we get to verse 15, after those traveling companions and others, finally in verse 14, the will of the Lord be done, they accept that this is a preparation, not a warning. Now in verse 15, after these things, Luke writes, we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking us to Manasseh of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing with whom we were to lodge. Again, we've made this point several times, but it's still fun to watch how accurate, how specific Luke is in the language, that they're going to travel from the port town, the coastal city of Caesarea, up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is much higher elevation than, of course, Caesarea. And that's the way you would say it if you were there. Again, we point out these little tidbits because if this is some sort of myth or legend that's been made up by the church centuries later, these are not the kinds of little tiny details that you would expect to appear. Natural, if you were there, it would make an impression. Sort of like if you had taken some trip, let's say you went up to Montana, the Glacier National Park, and it was an unusual snowstorm in early summer, which can happen there. And so you got up there and it got cold and you didn't expect it because you're a tourist from the south and all of a sudden you've got a little snow on the ground for a day or two. Well, when you're talking about Glacier National Park or your experience of it, that's something you would mention. Is, man, that was so cold. We had to have extra hot chocolate and wear sweaters because it was cold. However, it's beautiful and we saw the bears and the rocks and etc. That's what Luke is doing. He was there. This is an accurate eyewitness account of these events. They're going to stay with someone who is also of Cyprus. Makes you wonder if he was related to Barnabas. You would think they would know each other at this point at least. But he's apparently has the means and the room to lodge Paul and this group that's traveling with him. That would have been an unusually large house, other than the average, more than the average Jew would have had at that time. So in verse 7, when they do get to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. Right? So good fellowship, great relationships. And the following day, so it sounds like they're going to, like most people, they're going to rest and recover. And then Paul is going to go in with us to James and all the elders who were present. This is the James, the half-brother of the Lord, if you will, the elder, one of the elders of the church in Jerusalem that we read about in chapter 15. And so he's, of course, still serving as a shepherd in Jerusalem, as well as others. And so those that are there, because they're traveling about, moving around, and again, it's unlikely that the Apostle Paul would have sent an email of his itinerary. So who's there is how this goes. And so after Paul greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, which is what he did back in Acts chapter 15. And certainly this would be the good news. These are the fun conversations about what all has been going on. And in a natural setting, you would expect that the elders or those in Jerusalem would have done the same. Here's what God's been up to. Here's what God's been doing. That's what Christians like to talk about. Certainly Christian leaders that are interested in kingdom growth, that's going to be the main topic of conversation is what's going well, what's not going well, what it appears that God is doing, and perhaps even the opportunity to discuss what isn't so clear. What is God doing, or why is this happening? That's kind of the normal conversations you would expect. So, verse 20, and when they heard it, they began glorifying God, and they said to him, before I get into what they say, you can tell that Paul is giving all credit to God, and that's what they do. They don't say, oh, Paul, you're such an amazing missionary. Nobody could do the job you're doing as an apostle to the Gentiles. They glorify God as is appropriate. You remember way back in Matthew chapter 5, that's exactly what Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, that we are to serve in such a way that when men see our good works, our Father is glorified, not us. And that's exactly what we see happening with Paul and the elders in Jerusalem. So they glorify God and they say, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. Well, yeah, there was 3,000 that were baptized way back in Acts chapter 2, and that has continued to grow throughout those early chapters in Acts. And so the elders point out this, that they are zealous for all the law, which is the rub point. In fact, they had a huge conversation, a discussion, and a debate back in Acts chapter 15. There wasn't any hard guidance given. What we learned from we call it the council, the meeting, the assembly, the group, the conversation in Acts chapter 15. What was determined was that, and James will mention here in a bit, there's only three things that they ask for the Gentile churches to consider, not in terms of law, but to help ease the relationship between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. But it's made very clear in Acts 15 and again here that the law itself and all that it embodied was not to be continued in terms of requirements in order to be saved. Now, the Jewish Christians who had that Jewish heritage would continue many of those things, and as long as it's never elevated to a requirement in order to be saved, that would be fine. Those traditions certainly honored God. The ideas of the Passover and Pentecost, for example, those were still memorial feasts of what God, the great work that God did in the past in the book of Exodus with the children of Israel, and that's something we try to remember today. That'd be totally appropriate. Now, it would be interesting if you were still trying to keep the sacrificial system, that is, if you felt the need to go into the temple and offer an animal sacrifice, that would be a problem because that would be a rejection of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And so you don't see the temple worship per se being repeated, but the idea of not eating unclean foods, keeping in mind the memorial feasts and holidays like Pentecost and Passover and Booths and so on, as far as the remembrance and so on. So what James says is, there's a whole lot of Jewish Christians that are still real zealous for the law. They still see it as something that was given to them from God, and certainly it was. But you can also feel a little friction in that they're having some trouble letting go of that, which is what the book of Galatians deals with. The book of Hebrews deals with that particularly. It's almost like the book of Hebrews is a treatise to say, look, Jesus is what is better, that Jesus has made the law obsolete, and so on, to try to help this transition. Well, James goes on to say in verse 21, "And they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children nor to walk according to the customs." So that's the rumor, that Paul has been attacking the law of Moses, or certainly telling the Jews that they shouldn't be keeping it anymore. And what's interesting is that it's true that they don't need to, but that's not been Paul's emphasis. And you could see where that could develop. I could imagine the scenario where Jesus is talking about how Jesus is the Messiah and that he's fulfilled the law and that we live in the covenant of Christ, that somebody in the back of the room likely would raise their hand and say, "Does that mean we still have to keep the law also?" And the answer would be, well, no. But if you're listening for a certain thing, you could see where that's all you would seize on, and Paul's teaching us not to keep the law. Well, yes and no. What he's teaching us is the law has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. If you want to do some things to honor God along those ways, if you still want to take your Sabbath or Saturday and spend that day in worship and focus on God, by all means. You want to do that on Sunday, you want to do it on Monday, by all means, as he specifically addresses later in the letters that he writes. But there have been some that have seized on, so he's teaching against the law, which is, of course, what riles the Jews up and gets them so upset, which we'll see later in this chapter. So the point here is not, we're not debating which laws are to be carried forward into the new covenant or not, but rather, are there any unnecessary obstacles? I mean, if they're going to reject Jesus, if Jesus is a stumbling block, there's nothing that can be done about that. But if there's any unnecessary obstacles that could be removed, then let's try to help ease that along to try to keep people engaged in this conversation as long as possible. So that's what they say in verse 22. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. So how, excuse me, how do you prevent this premature explosion before people get a chance to listen? Well, here's their advice in verse 23. "Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads." A typical Jewish custom coming out of the book of Leviticus, that they've made a vow about something, they've made a promise about something, and they're going to keep that. Maybe it's has to do more about study, or it's more about the relationship with God, or it's dealing with a certain sin, or trying to come to terms with a certain challenge in their own lives. But then when they're done, what they'll do is go to the priest and they'll shave their heads, they'll cut their hair, and that means all the old is gone, is kind of the symbolism, and there is a sacrifice to be offered. Now, don't forget that when a sacrifice is made, somebody's got to buy it, right? You've got to go buy that animal, and especially if you're still dealing with some of the problems in the temple that Jesus cast folks out for when he was there, then it's not necessarily going to be cheap. And so if Paul will purify himself according to temple standards, which doesn't run afoul of the gospel of Christ, and if he would provide the money himself for these other folks to be able to buy their sacrifices necessary to complete this process, then you'll see that the others will see that Paul is not preaching against the temple or telling Jews not to be Jews any longer. So just as we read in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul's willing to do this. Not because he has to, right? Because remember, he's not being bossed around by the elders. They're not in charge of Paul's ministry. The Lord is. But if this helps, and you'll see in the very next chapter how much Paul wants to talk to the Jews, how much he wants to share with them, how he wants to communicate with them, as Romans 9 and 10 says, he has a heart, and a desperate heart, for their salvation. So the idea would be that if he would do this, they say, "And all will know that there's nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourselves walk orderly, keeping the law." But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote," now they reference what was already discussed back in Acts chapter 15, "we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from fornication." So they haven't changed at all what they're saying, and they clarify that with Paul. They make sure everybody understands we're not putting on Gentiles any burden beyond this. So what we're trying to do is to keep the Jews calm enough where maybe they can hear the gospel. They're trying to consider how to remove any possible potential unnecessary roadblock to them hearing. When we get upset, when we get frustrated, we don't hear well. We get angry. We start formulating a response. It's even interesting in emergency situations. They tell us that the first thing to go is hearing. If we're really startled, really afraid, really angry, they've done this study with soldiers in combat. They've done it with pilots in the cockpit when things are starting to go wrong. That they've had to put warning lights and symbols and things right in front of where the pilot can see it. In the early days, they put alarms and chimes and different sounds for different problems in the headset of the pilot. But what they learned was that when the pilot's under duress, the first thing that kind of goes is hearing. They're just not paying attention. It's not that they've become deaf. They ignore it. They don't process that. And so this is an attempt to try to keep the Jews listening as long as possible. So they clarify, they make sure we're not changing anything, we're not making this a burden or a law on anyone else. But Paul, we think this might help you with the Jews. I mean, he's in Jerusalem, right? And if you're out in Rome or you're out in Philippi or whatever, there's a very small contingent of Jews. But you're in Jerusalem. So if the goal is to keep Jews listening and you're in Jerusalem, then this is a way to be helpful. So verse 26, without complaint or struggle, Paul took them in, and the next day, so he's absolutely in agreement, sounds good. And it kind of reminds you of the role that shepherds or elders play. These are older, experienced men that have some wisdom, and that's what they're offering is here's some wisdom to try to help ease this along. So he purified himself along with them. He went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So it was a good faith effort to try to help folks understand what Paul really believes. Well, it is a good attempt to try to remove any unnecessary obstacle. Unfortunately, it won't be enough. Verse 27 continues, when the 7 days were almost over, so as they're coming out of this ending of the vows, the offering of the sacrifices, here's the key phrase, the Jews from Asia. And here's just an example of where the brokenness in humanity causes things to go wrong, and what a very unhealthy and what an unjust way to do conversation, communication, you might even argue relationships. So these are the Jews from Asia. These are the folks that have been stirring up this mess in the first place. They're the ones that are creating the rumor. This is where it's coming from, and they have followed Paul town to town along the way, as we have seen. So they come in because they're there for Pentecost too, just like Paul. So they come in. So they've already got a very prejudiced point of view, right? They've already quit listening to Paul quite a while ago. So upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowds and lay hands on him, because that's what they do. They did that in the towns. And now they're on home turf. I mean, this is a temple. They know how to speak Jew. They know the sensitivities. They know the buttons to push. So as soon as they see him, he's a target. And given their prejudice, given where they already believe that Paul's at, they're already deeply offended and very upset that Paul's even in the temple. He shouldn't be there. He is definitely one that should be cast out. So they grab him, right, and stir folks up. And here's the claim in verse 28. Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law in this place. No, no, and no. Paul does not speak against the people. Actually, Paul wants the people to be saved. He's never said it was bad to be a Jew. He's never stirred up any Roman or Greek authorities against the Jews. None of that. That's a lie. And the law? No. There is an important distinction between the abolishing of the law and the fulfillment of the law, which is exactly what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6. Let's turn there real quick over to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 and listen to the language that Jesus uses in this conversation. Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 5. He says in verse 17, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets," because to abolish is to destroy, to erase. "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill," to complete it, to do the very thing that the law and the prophets is waiting on. That's why we still have our Old Testaments today, because as Paul would write in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it's written for our example and for our instruction, and we learn so much from it. In fact, honestly, the New Testament assumes we know the Old Testament. For you have to go to the Old Testament, to Genesis, to read about creation, where we came from, to understand God's view of sin and how it is that Jesus arrived and why he was needed and how it is that he's the fulfillment of God's great work since the beginning of time. All of that's in the Old Testament, not in the New. So the New Testament rests on the foundation of the Old Testament, but as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, it's written for our example. It's not written to be our law. That was true for the Jews, not true for Christians. Again, probably the clearest and most simple example would be that if the Old Testament law was still binding, then we still would be required to go to the temple in Jerusalem and offer the various animal sacrifices as prescribed in the book of Leviticus and Exodus. Numbers as well, I guess. However, that would be not just a travesty, that would be blasphemy, because we would then be saying that Jesus offering up his body on the cross, his death on the cross, his burial and resurrection would be inadequate, insufficient, that yes, Jesus sacrificed for us as a substitutionary atoning sacrifice, but we still need to offer up lambs and goats and so on. That would be blasphemy indeed. And the book of Hebrews makes that very clear, that the law is obsolete, that it's been fulfilled in the new, the better covenant in the blood of Christ. So Paul is not speaking against the law in that the law was negative. He speaks quite a bit about that in the book of Romans, about how, no, it's still from God. It was good and right in the first place. The problem was not the law, but man, we couldn't keep it. We needed the grace of God offered through the blood of Christ on Calvary's cross. So, and again, they're just twisting it to get folks mad, and it works, and against this place, that is the temple. Well, why would Paul be there if that would be the case? And now we make the jump. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. Now, this is tremendous. This is a great example of the terrible falsehoods that people will go to get what they want. So what they've said is inaccurate, flat wrong in analyzing Paul's teaching, but that's a fairly intellectual kind of conversation, and you have to parse, as we have, that Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to abolish the law, and we're having kind of a technical conversation about that. But if all else fails, go to an emotional argument. There's nothing that beats an emotional argument for getting your way. In most settings, the most immature people win in an argument unless there are real adults in the room that set some real clear parameters or guidelines. In other words, whoever gets the most emotional, whoever gets the angriest, the loudest, they make everybody else uncomfortable. And so what is human nature is everybody will cave in just to keep the peace, because it's just confrontation is uncomfortable and we don't want to deal with it. So we'll just, you know what, if we can just keep you happy, maybe you'll go away. So they give an intellectual argument about how Paul's teaching and all that, but that would require some exploration, well, now wait a minute, what has he said and what does the law say and how does that fit with prophecies? And that would be a really sort of calm intellectual pursuit. That's not what's going to happen. So the next step is to say, he's even brought Greeks into this temple and defiled this holy place. That's just an emotional reaction. One, it's also completely wrong. Paul wouldn't do that. Why go to the trouble of doing the purification and helping with the sacrifices and the vow keeping and all that, if you're going to blow all that out of the water by bringing a Greek in, that's going to get all the Jews upset. And so it is an incredible emotional argument that they are assuming, because they're the last step in what's called a phase 5 conflict. When you're talking about conflict resolution, you've got 5 phases, and the 5th and final phase is when it's so broken down that it isn't able to be fixed by the participants because, and some of the signs are, because nobody's listening, and you are reading one another's mind. You are speaking to the person's assumptions, their motivations, what they're thinking. So you're claiming to know what they're thinking, why they're doing something. We say things like, well, I'll tell you why they did that. I know why they did that. They did that because they were this, and they're trying to do this, and they're thinking that because they're like this. That's a claim to mind reading, right? Well, that's what they're doing. They're claiming knowledge they don't have because they are not witnesses of Paul bringing any Greek into the temple. They've made the jump, they've made the assumption because they've already decided that's the kind of guy he is, and that's what his motive is, and that's what his purpose is, that's what he's trying to do. So verse 29 says, For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him. And they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Supposed to be the key word here. See, they wouldn't even associate with the Greek in the first place. So the fact that Paul is with somebody from Ephesus, that's already got them horrified. And now they've made some assumptions, they've made some leaps, because there is a certain outcome that they want. So they're going to make the claim, well, he's brought him into the temple. I mean, after all, why wouldn't he? Because he's already speaking against his place. He's already speaking against the law. He's already speaking against our people. So obviously, he wouldn't care about the temple at all and bring a Greek. Well, that's not at all what Paul did. But it has the desired effect. They get an emotional reaction in verse 30. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they were dragging him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut behind him, and they're seeking to kill him. Right then, right there, mob violence, like they've already done. Remember, these are the Jews from Asia. They've already stoned him and left him for dead once. It's almost like they're thinking, this time we're going to make sure we get it done. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to try to kill him right there with mob violence. So while they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Overstated, but still the temple is going to be very crowded. Lots of Jews there. Lots of folks out in the marketplace because of the Pentecost feast and all the Jews being there. So you get all this stirred up in Ephesus, we saw an entire stadium filled as people chanted for hours, "Great is Diana." So it's just not that hard to get us riled up about things that we don't even understand, nor even know what's happening. It's kind of a tale as old as time and just as embarrassing. So he hears that all Jerusalem is in confusion. Well, he's there to keep the peace, and the Jews have been notorious for being hard to get along with. My understanding is in the Roman system of rule and civil authority, military authority as well, that you got sent to this part of the world if somebody was mad at you. Because it's just one kind of fomenting rebellion after another. And so that's kind of what's expected, and so that's the way they react. Verse 32, At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. They were trying to kill him by beating him to death. They'd already started. So he's brought some soldiers and some centurions. These are some rough customers. These are experienced, battle-hardened veterans. My understanding is they're equivalent to a lot of what we would recognize as sergeants. These are your senior, up front, in the trenches troops that have a whole lot of real hands-on experience. So these guys know how to handle themselves, and they know how to handle these Jews. They're going to be able to clear a path. They're not going to be intimidated by the noise and the ruckus and the carryings on. And sure enough, when the crowd sees who shows up, the Roman and his centurions and others, they stop. All right, because this would be fairly intimidating, and they've come along with a focused purpose. They stop beating Paul because they are well on their way to trying to beat him to death, which is just It's just the example of how out of control this emotional situation has become. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he began asking who he was and what he had done. Interesting response. First thing he does is chain up Paul and then starts trying to figure out what's happened. That's going to come up in a few verses, but part of that is that's kind of a good way to stop everybody, because if the crowd sees that this villain is being handled or subdued at least, then okay, maybe things are going along as they should. It certainly stops things from escalating any further, certainly grossly unfair to Paul. But he starts trying to find out, all right, well, who's this guy? What has he done? Well, all that's been said is a bunch of Jewish gobbledygook, to a Roman anyway. Because Paul, let's see what the charges are. Paul has spoken against the Jews as a Jew. He's spoken against the law, and he's spoken against the temple, and he brought in a Greek into the Jewish temple. Well, that matters a lot to the Jews, but it would mean little to nothing to the Roman. But people haven't even gotten all of that information, because as happens in the crowds, they've gotten whipped up into a violent state without any real thinking or reason to process. That's why those that are blessed to live in countries and societies that have the sense of due process and the ideas like innocent until proven guilty, not forced to testify against yourself, and so on, that there ought to be a process of justice, and that is it has to slow down in order to be just. Mob violence, lynching, those kinds of things don't give the opportunity for due process, for a full investigation of all the facts involved, and a calm, level-headed, clear-minded analysis of what has happened and not, and evidence gained, and so on. None of that happens when people are screaming and yelling and just grab you. So, verse 34, but among the crowd some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, it doesn't make any sense to him at all what people are yelling. And even if they were yelling the things of the original accusation back in verse 27, I doubt that would make sense to the Romans, especially that they're going to try to beat a guy to death in the street over it. So he doesn't know what to do with this. So he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. In other words, remove Paul from the situation, which will allow the situation to calm down. It does protect Paul, which is part of the process, no doubt. But by separating the two, Paul from the crowd, he can get things calmed down, keep it from escalating. Verse 35, when he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. That's interesting. When he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers. He didn't walk up the stairs, carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. If the soldiers could ring around Paul, that would keep the crowd off of Paul. The crowd is already subdued. They're not going to mess with a bunch of centurions. So couldn't the soldiers have surrounded Paul and then gone up the steps to the barracks? It's not like the crowd's going to surge up the steps into the Roman barracks. Nobody's that brave. They're not that tough all of a sudden. So what's sad but yet what is inspiring? They have to carry Paul up the steps because he can't walk up the steps because the crowd has been so violent. Well, what were they doing to Paul when the Roman soldiers got there? They were beating him. So Paul has already been injured enough, he's not able to climb the stairs. They have to carry him. So he's already fairly bruised and battered at this point. That's what's going to make chapter 22 so incredible, is that when Paul gives his defense, when Paul addresses the crowd, he will do so from a very bloodied, battered, and bruised position. Verse 36, for the multitude of the people kept following them, shouting, away with him. So the soldiers had to get between the crowd and Paul, because the crowd is still fomenting. They're still vicious. They're still in this knee-jerk, emotional, animalistic type, passionate state with no reason, no reasoning process, a purely emotional process. they're still just going nuts. And so the Romans are going to distance Paul from the crowd. But what follows in the final paragraph is Paul is going to address the Roman in a way that startles the Roman. And we need to look at why now, what Paul is going to, the card that Paul's going to pull from his pocket, sort of his ace in the hole, the card he's going to show the Roman, he doesn't always show. And we can reflect on how Paul says, I become all things to all men so that by all means I may win some. There are times when Paul uses his cards. There's times that he doesn't. Much like we saw his discussion in 1 Corinthians all through chapter 9 about he had the right to be supported, chose not to, because in that setting it would advance the gospel further, or at least it would remove more unnecessary obstacles if he would choose to do certain things while he was in Corinth. We're watching him do it live and on the fly here in Acts chapter 21. So something to be thinking about as we continue our study is, why does Paul flash his Roman citizenship card here and doesn't earlier, like say in chapter 16, when he gets beaten and put in prison and in chains, but he does here? And then consider the address that will begin in chapter 22 from a man who had to be carried up the stairs in order to deliver it. Things to consider as we prepare for our next lesson.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive.